He didn't see her as a person until she made his son speak. All it took was a trembling hand and a spilled glass of wine. The Montclair was not just a restaurant. It was a stage for the powerful to display their curated personas. With its glass walls overlooking the skyline, velvet booths, and a jazz trio tucked into a candlelit corner, it offered sanctuary to men like Richard Hudson, men who dealt in power, not people. Tonight, Richard sat at his usual corner table, alone, except for his 10-year-old son. Jake Hudson, once known for his uncontainable laughter and endless questions, now sat stiff and wordless in his chair. Since the accident 6 months ago, the boy hadn't uttered a syllable. His eyes rarely moved. His therapists called it trauma-induced mutism. Richard just called it hell. The wine had just arrived, 2005 Chateau Margaux, a bottle worth more than the monthly rent of most diners there. The waitress approached slowly, carefully balancing the tray. Her name tag read, Tamara. She couldn't have been older than 30, with dark eyes full of quiet alertness, skin the color of deep mahogany, pressed apron, calm posture, invisible, the way staff are trained to be, until her hand trembled. Just slightly. A half-second hesitation as she glanced at Jake. A flicker of, was it recognition? Sympathy? Then it happened. The glass tipped sideways, a silent, treacherous splash. Crimson arcs cut across Richard's pristine white shirt and dark charcoal jacket. The silence that followed was louder than any crash. Richard stood slowly, every movement precise, like a machine warming up for destruction. His voice, when it came, was a sharp scalpel. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" Tamara didn't move. She held the napkin out, steady now, eyes lowered. She didn't explain, didn't beg, just stood, like someone used to being shouted at by people with nameplates and unchecked tempers. Gasps rippled through the dining room. Forks paused mid-air. A couple near the bar whispered behind their wine glasses. The restaurant manager, a thin man with slicked-back hair, was already striding toward them, face red, apologies rehearsed. But before he could speak, another voice broke the tension. Small, fragile. "Please, don't yell at her." Heads turned. Richard froze. Jake, his son. The boy who hadn't spoken in over half a year had just spoken. The child's lips trembled. His fingers moved slightly on the table's edge. His eyes, not vacant, not hollow, but present, were on Tamara. A breathless silence fell over the restaurant. Somewhere in the back, a spoon clattered. The manager stopped mid-step. One of the jazz musicians whispered, "Did that kid just talk?" Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He turned toward Jake. There were tears in his eyes. His own, not the boy's. Tamara met Jake's gaze with the softest smile. No surprise, no theatrics, just a nod. A knowing one, like she'd been waiting. Outside, the city pulsed as usual. Horns, sirens, neon. Inside the Montclair, however, time had collapsed into a singular point of disbelief. Tamara excused herself before anyone could say another word. She vanished into the staff doors, like a ripple retreating from the surface of still water. Richard remained frozen for another 10 seconds before sitting down, robotically. Jake had already returned to silence, but the air around him had changed. He no longer looked hollow. He looked like someone who'd been heard. The valet brought the Bentley around, and Richard sat behind the wheel in the quiet, forgetting to start the car. He looked at Jake through the rearview mirror. The boy had fallen asleep, his small face resting gently against the leather headrest, peaceful, but not lifeless. His son had spoken, not to him, not for him, for her. He didn't sleep that night. He stared at ceiling shadows, remembered Jake's voice, remembered Tamara's face, calm, unreadable, strong. At 2 a.m., he poured himself a glass of that same Margot and didn't taste a drop of it. Who was she? Why Jake? And why, of all moments, then? The next afternoon, Richard returned to Montclair. No reservation, no entourage. Just him. He asked for the waitress from the night before. Tamara. The hostess stiffened. She's in the back. I can... Tell her I'm not here to complain, Richard said. I just want to ask her a question. 5 minutes later, she stepped out, still in uniform. He stood up. What did you do to my son? He asked. Too direct, too raw. Tamara didn't blink. I spoke to him, she said quietly. That's all. Richard exhaled, confused and on edge. He hasn't said a word in 6 months. Tamara nodded. I know. I've been serving you for 4. Richard's eyes widened. Wait, what? I leave notes, she said. For him, every time you dine here. He stared. Notes? She reached into her apron, unfolded a worn square of paper. You matter. It's okay to be quiet. You're more than what happened to you. Messages. Simple, consistent, folded into napkins, slipped under his bread plate. You're telling me. He read those? Tamara smiled, finally a small curl of it. Every time. He never looked at me, but he'd read them. I know, because I started seeing him trace his finger over the words. Richard was silent. A man who thought money could fix anything, now realizing it had never even touched the right place. Tamara continued. My mom was a caregiver. She used to say, the body can forget how to move, the brain can forget how to speak, but the soul never forgets who listens. She held his gaze. I just listened to your son, even when he didn't speak back. Richard looked away, swallowing hard. I spent $2 million on specialists. None of them got him to say a word. Tamara didn't flinch, because they spoke at him, not to him. That night, Richard opened Jake's bedroom drawer. Inside, he found napkins, folded, carefully pressed, all with the same handwriting, all with Tamara's words. His son hadn't been silent. He'd just been waiting. The morning sun cut through the blinds in sharp, diagonal beams, casting a grid of light and shadow across the pristine white walls of the Hudson estate. Richard sat alone at the breakfast table, staring blankly at a pile of medical bills and therapy reports. The silence was thick, as if it had substance. It pressed down on him harder than any suit of armor he'd ever worn. Jake sat across from him, silent as always. His fingers toyed absent-mindedly with the edge of a napkin. The boy's eyes were fixed on the window, distant yet watching, a silent observer trapped in his own world. Richard's phone buzzed. A message popped up from Tamara. I left a note on Jake's plate today. He didn't touch his food, but held the napkin a long time. He swallowed hard, staring at the screen as if it were a fragile lifeline. Tamara was a ghost in a world where ghosts didn't belong. A waitress in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, surrounded by people who never looked beyond her uniform, her skin, or the tray she carried. But every day, in small, invisible ways, she was fighting a war. Her own life was a constant struggle against invisibility. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, Tamara learned early that the world was quick to dismiss those who didn't fit the glossy mold. Her mother's stories about patients who healed not just through medicine but through kindness stayed with her. And so did the fierce promise Tamara made to herself, to see people as they were, not as the world forced them to be. So she watched Jake, not as a silent boy, but as a prisoner. She watched the way his hands twitched when no one else noticed, the faintest spark in his eyes when she smiled, the way his breathing shifted when she bent down to clear his tray. She knew the therapist's jargon, knew the money poured into appointments that yielded no words, no smiles, no breakthroughs. But she also knew something else, something that no amount of money could buy. Back in the restaurant kitchen, whispers followed her. "Why spend so much time on that kid?" one chef sneered. "He's not our problem," muttered another. Tamara ignored them. The real battle wasn't out here in the fluorescent-lit kitchen, where sarcasm and resentment were served with every order. It was inside. Inside the quiet moments when she folded her notes and slipped them under Jake's plate. Those notes were more than words. They were seeds. You are not alone. It's okay to be scared. You are stronger than you think. Each note carried a piece of Tamara's belief, her hope, a defiance against the cold indifference surrounding them. Meanwhile, Richard's world was unraveling in ways he hadn't expected. His wealth had shielded him from failure, but not from guilt, not from fear. The sight of his son breaking the silence, even just for a moment, shook him to his core. He realized he'd spent years buying solutions, chasing experts, ignoring the one thing he needed to see: connection. The relentless pressure of his boardroom battles and public image now seemed shallow, meaningless. The truth was raw and unforgiving. He was losing his son. That afternoon, Richard arranged a private meeting with Jake's therapists. He paced in the sterile clinic room, demanding answers, results, progress. But the therapist's calm, practiced words only deepened his frustration. "It's a slow process," one said gently. "Trauma rewires the brain." But Richard wanted a miracle. Later that day, Richard sat with Tamara in the back of the restaurant, away from prying eyes and gossiping staff. He watched her quietly, trying to understand. "Why did you start leaving notes?" he asked, voice low. Tamara looked down, then met his gaze. "Because I saw him looking at me," she said simply, even when he didn't want to be seen. Richard felt the weight of her words. He realized she had done what no doctor, no specialist, no amount of money could. She believed. Over the next weeks, tension mounted. The restaurant became a microcosm of the larger world's prejudices. Tamara faced subtle hostility from some staff, whose smiles never quite reached their eyes when she passed. They whispered about getting too close to a rich man's family. The management watched her more closely. Rumors began to swirl. Questions about why she spent so much time near the Hudson table, about her intentions, about her place. She felt the weight of their judgment, but never wavered. Her fight was not just for Jake. It was for every overlooked soul in a world too busy to notice. Jake's world slowly shifted. One evening, Tamara found him tracing the words from a napkin with trembling fingers. His eyes flickered with recognition. His lips parted slightly. A breath, a whisper. The breakthrough was fragile, a tentative bridge between silence and speech. Richard stood by, tears streaming silently, as his son spoke a single word: "Thank you." But victory came with cost. The restaurant's upper management, uncomfortable with Tamara's growing influence, threatened her job. "Stick to your duties," the manager warned coldly. "Don't get involved." Tamara refused. She knew the risk. Losing this job meant losing the fragile foothold she had in Jake's world. But losing her voice, or her conviction, was never an option. One night, after closing, Richard found Tamara alone in the empty restaurant, cleaning tables. He approached quietly. "I want to help," he said. Tamara shook her head. "This isn't about money," she replied. "It's about seeing people," she added. "Hearing what they can't say." Richard nodded slowly. He realized that to save his son, he would have to change, not just in his wealth or influence, but in how he saw the world. And Jake? He began to speak more often, not just words, but sentences, emotions, hopes. He found his voice in the quiet spaces between Tamara's notes and Richard's growing presence. The fight was far from over. But the first cracks in the silence had appeared. The unseen battle was becoming visible and unstoppable. The air in the Montclair felt different now. It was a quiet storm brewing beneath the polished chandeliers and crystal glasses. Richard Hudson sat at the head of the table, no longer the detached billionaire, but a man reshaped by humility and hope. Jake, sitting beside him, smiled. A real, honest smile that lit up his face like the sunrise after a long, dark night. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy. It had started with a simple act of kindness. A folded note slipped beneath a napkin. But that small gesture ignited a chain reaction that none of them could have predicted. Tamara had risked everything: the gossip behind her back, the management's cold warnings, even her job. But she had held on, because she believed, because she saw Jake when no one else would. The breakthrough had come slowly. Words at first, tentative, halting. Then sentences, then laughter, the kind that chokes back tears. Richard recalled the night Jake had said thank you for the first time in months. He remembered how the restaurant had fallen silent, how every head had turned, how eyes had filled with tears, and how Richard had finally understood that his son was not broken. That night, Richard called an emergency meeting with Jake's therapists. He stood in the stark white office, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I was wrong," he confessed. "It wasn't about the latest therapy, the fancy doctors, or the money. It was about connection, faith, someone believing in him." The therapists exchanged glances. Some nodded slowly, others smiled. That moment shifted everything. Meanwhile, Tamara had become more than a waitress. She was a guardian of hope. Word began to spread about the young boy who had spoken again, thanks to the woman who saw beyond the uniform. Local news picked up the story. A feature article called her the voice behind the silence. Her name was no longer whispered in the kitchen. It was spoken with respect. But with recognition came resistance. One afternoon, the restaurant manager called her into his office. "This can't continue," he said sternly. "Your involvement with Mr. Hudson's family is causing unrest." Tamara looked him in the eye. "Jake's breakthrough is not my secret. It's his right, and it belongs to anyone who refuses to give up on him." She handed him a folded napkin. On it, a simple message. Sometimes the smallest voices are the loudest. He didn't respond, but he didn't fire her either. The most profound change, however, was in Richard. He was no longer the man who commanded rooms with his fortune. He was a father who listened. One evening, he sat beside Jake on the couch. Without prompting, Jake reached out and took his hand. "Dad," he whispered. Richard's heart shattered and soared at once. "Jake," he replied, voice thick. "I'm here." Their bond grew stronger. Words became bridges across the silence. Tamara's notes continued, not just at the restaurant, but at home, in therapy sessions, tucked inside books and backpacks. Then came the day of the foundation launch. Richard stood before a room full of reporters, philanthropists, and advocates. His son was beside him, more alive and present than anyone had dared hope. The Laverne Project, Richard announced, is dedicated to families like mine, to the people who are seen as broken, silent, invisible, to those who need more than treatments and tests. They need belief. He gestured toward Tamara. This woman saved my son, not with medicine, not with money, with patience, respect, and love. The crowd erupted in applause. Jake, overwhelmed but radiant, squeezed Tamara's hand. Backstage, Richard pulled Tamara aside. "I owe you more than I can say," he whispered. She smiled. "No," she replied. "You owe him. He gave me the courage to keep believing." Months later, Jake's progress astonished doctors. He spoke fluently, laughed often, and even started attending school regularly. His voice was not just heard, it was celebrated. The restaurant, once a place of cold glances and quiet judgments, had transformed. A new respect permeated its walls. Tamara was promoted to community liaison, a role where she could advocate for those often overlooked. The story of a spilled glass of wine had become a legend, not of anger, but of transformation, of power humbled by kindness, of silence broken by belief. One evening, Richard and Jake sat on the rooftop of their penthouse, looking out over the city lights. Jake leaned into his father. "Thank you," he said softly. Richard smiled, tears in his eyes. "No, son. Thank you for teaching me how to listen." And somewhere, deep inside them all, a new truth had taken root. Sometimes, it takes one small act, one whisper of hope, to ignite a roar that changes everything.